Okay, this Koine news broadcast. Koine, if this is the first video that you, I guess, clicked on or whatever you call it, selected, this means common, and it's the kind of language the original New Testament was written, in which the original New Testament was written. So Koine is like a coin in your pocket, and this is, we'll start with what does it look like in English, this word election. And if you go to 1 Peter 1:2, you see that he has in English, that is the Common or King James Version. And of course, I don't know how to decide yet if you should be using the Cambridge King James. I've only owned an Oxford King James. I didn't mean to laugh, but some people are out there actually telling me I've been using the wrong one. And then others are telling me I should only use this one. But I don't find very many people using it. But notice here, I don't find very many people using King James Version for much of anything. Settle, especially all these outlandish doctrinal dilemmas, which it's hard to take seriously something when someone's asking me to pick the right or wrong side of a bad argument. So let's just look at it in English. Well, here Peter calls these people elect, and then he establishes by this phrase here. This is from a simple preposition, K-A-T-A, kata, and it very well is a good translation of that as far as bringing out the use of this preposition to show the relation. So you can see, first of all, that the question of conditional or unconditional, which is a negation of conditional, really isn't the notion of the text. The idea of election is the relational term needs to be what's distinguished about election. That is, before you get all worked up on picking conditional or unconditional, you might want to say that you believe in election according to the foreknowledge of God. And I'll give you an example. Judas, he was elected, chosen, often translated chosen, and he was used to give Christ alongside, which is a long phrase for the word betray. And it says that Christ told him when he chose him, or chose the 12, that one was a devil. So there was no according to the foreknowledge, that is, this word here is for. Now he had foreknowledge as far as information, which I'll just use the word for data as far as information, but there was no election of Judas according to God's fixing of his love upon him, which is what this refers to. And we can look at Romans 5:8 and continue to look at it even in the English text for a moment, and then I'll work it out for you. But let's just remember according to the foreknowledge, and then let's think of what was different about Judas being chosen and someone being chosen according to foreknowledge. So Romans 5:8, for example. Romans 5:8, and it literally, in the very common expression, in the King James it says, "But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." Now, somebody may be saying, well, how do you go from election to Romans 5:8? Well, I'll show you very quickly. Very common translation. Moreover, the God, definite article, the God. Now I'm going to write this out literally. All the words that are used are placed together from which the word commendeth comes from. It's from one word which means position. God positioned, and I'll hyphenate there, his particular love and pick back up with this word together with. Position his particular love together, and it then says onto us, or into us, into us. And this position together with is really a strong word. It's placing and then something being joined together, literally. Now you say, well, what does that have to do with election according to the foreknowledge? Well, this is why I say it's sad to see so much discussion about things like election, which is basically anyone's allowed to connote it, define it, come up with whatever ideas they want. It's like foreknowledge. They can make that foredata, that is information only prior to, and that's not what the term's about. In Deuteronomy 7:7, staying in the English for a moment, it says, "The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any people, for you were the fewest of all people." So, without reading the Hebrew, which you all can learn it just as easily as Koine, Hebrew's it's a very good, very pattern-formatted language. So, let's just leave this for a moment and look at Deuteronomy 7:7. This, he says, God did not set his love upon you. Look at that. Positioned together onto us. Notice the correlation now. And then notice we're talking about love. So in Deuteronomy 7, we're talking about where God literally, in his love for the nation of Israel, he's calling his choosing and fixing his love on them, which would be what we know in history now. We can look back and see that he used that nation. And of course, individuals in that nation were certainly not coerced nor or limited or refused from believing personally. Actually, they were more accountable as God's chosen people. For those of you that actually read what God said in Amos about the people that he loved above all families of the earth, he would call them into account. So here, election we see in Deuteronomy 7 is about the love that God set, positioned. There's that word set or positioned. And it says literally upon you. And I'm just reading the English there, so I don't have to teach you Hebrew right now. And then you see this Romans 5:8. So now what do we know about election? If in election, since we know that it's an according to, and it's a place where God fixed his love on in the Old Testament. The Old Testament was direct, personal, that is all the persons, if you will, in Israel. It was that nation. And it says he fixed his love, or set his love upon them and chose. So set his love and chose upon them. So now if there's an accordance to, it's in accordance with this love that was set and this choice that was made upon them. And of course this was to Jewish, and in the limitation here was that it was direct for the Jews only, and it was indirect for the nations. Now you'll get this because this is grammar. It was indirect to the nations. And you say, how do you know that? Well, when you read in Ephesians 1:4, it says he chose us. That's direct object. Us was a direct object, and us is a personal pronoun, so it's direct and personal. And the people to whom Paul spoke that were Jews and Gentiles, which was what was radical about the statement. Certainly nothing radical about choice. Certainly nothing radical that we have today. These abstract new alarms, I suppose. These new riddles and things that have, or philosophies is what they are. So what we have now is election according to, and in this case back to Judas. Some of you are waiting, when are you going to get to Judas? Well, Judas was Jewish, of course. He was among that nation, but as an individual, Judas had not trusted the gospel. And Judas, among many, there were multitudes multitudes who cried, "Crucify." And that is, they betrayed Christ for free. Judas, as we compare him to the mob that cried out, "Crucify," and betrayed him, we say they did it freely, no charge. And Judas, 30 pieces of silver. And then Judas was the one selected. And you say, but from where was he selected? Well, he was selected from the multitude of plenty of people among the Jews who would have been, well, who demonstrated themselves happily. Now, I know that doesn't excite anyone and it doesn't satisfy the philosophical. It's just that otherwise we make the betrayal about Judas rather than Jesus. We make election not about the according to the foreknowledge, which is God setting His love upon and choosing people for His own purpose. And yes, Judas was one of God's elect. Now that is really shattering the tradition in people's mind that anytime you use the word elect, you're referring to someone that has personal faith in God. But that's not at all what the Bible teaches. And when Paul mentioned it and used that term in Romans 5:8, he's speaking now of Jews and Gentiles who did hear the gospel, who did believe the gospel, and on whom God then has made His application of His love together with onto them and chose them and because He loved them. And at the time he wrote in that letter to Peter, or Peter wrote that letter, that first letter that we were talking about, those people were undergoing persecution by Nero. So if you say, well, explain election then. Well, election, according to what Peter wrote to them, meant that God, by positioning His particular love, see how the Koine doesn't leave any doubt and not vague and ambiguous, His particular love together with, this is very strong, together with, and then the word onto, and then they were elect according to this work that God did of positioning His particular love together with. And that's what Romans 5:8 said. So for these people, because God did that, they suffered under Nero. So if you really want to be strict, as you can be, to fully appreciate what are the implications of election, I was never chosen to even be born at that time, and I wasn't chosen to hear the gospel at that time, and I wasn't chosen when I heard the gospel and believed the gospel to then have God to position His particular love together with onto me, and then I would then, because of that direct and personal purpose being applied to my life, which is actually His love being positioned onto me, He never used me to suffer under Nero. So you can see why in our country it's fun to talk about election and someone say, did God pick you to go to heaven, which is probably the most empty question I've ever heard. It never finds any demonstration. And it's ironic that Romans 5:8 says He commended His love towards us, and that while we were still devoted ones to negative testimony, He positioned His particular love together with onto us. And you can see all throughout history that when God chose people, even Judas, for example, one of the multitudes who had rejected Christ, and it really doesn't impress me to hear people ask, well, was that fair for Judas? Well, was it fair for the mob to be there at that time and to be in that crowd and be incited and to go along with something and be subject to the influence of the Pharisees and then be caused by that peer pressure of the Pharisees and intimidation to cry out, "Crucify"? I don't know how the question of fairness or unfairness applies to Judas any more than we do apply it to the crowd. I didn't live at that time. I can't say that if I were in the crowd that I would not have joined in, as Jesus said from the cross, "Forgive them, release them, for they don't know what they do," because it wasn't until the day of Pentecost that they found out what they had done. And what they had done was taken the Lord of glory and by wicked means murdered Him. And then God told them through Peter on the day of Pentecost and the other apostles who were preaching the same message that they had murdered the Messiah. Now, that's when they found out what they had done. But all the other abstractions and things are just probably recreational mental gymnastics because it doesn't include this. You think about all that Israel suffered, and people don't think that's the consequence of election. That's what it looks like when God positions His particular love onto someone. And in the Old Testament, that was for that nation and all the individual Jews to be directly selected, and then indirectly through that nation, indirectly the nations would be reached. Today, both Jews and Gentiles are directly reached. That is, directly have this purpose applied to them. And yes, that comes in the moment that we're born again, and that comes as a result of believe, punctular. I've already established that in so many videos that if you haven't got that yet, you're still playing philosophy. But when you believe, punctular, that is in this point of faith, then the new birth happens, and then you're believing. But in this believing process, which is this, it's in this process where you'll come to be baptized. It's in this process where you'll assemble together. It's in this process where you will commune according to the new covenant. It's in this process where you will learn of God's purpose for positioning His particular love together with onto you, and it might include suffering. Now, it won't be under Nero, of course, well, until a tyrant with his same character might rise again. But again, you can see why people don't really argue about who's been elected to go and suffer under Neronic persecution, or who's been elected to go out into all the world and preach the gospel to other nations, to all the nations. I tell people all the time when they ask me about election, I said, well, I was elected to go to church. You want to come go with me? And they really don't want to talk anymore. I said, well, I was elected to suffer for Christ's sake, and then they don't really want to talk anymore. So you can either study the Bible as those who've actually believed the gospel, actually as those who've been born again with a new mind, a new heart, a new spirit, as those whose minds are being renovated, as those who are actually learning and are responsible to learn for what purpose did God fix His love on us. It wasn't so that we might simply say we're now going to die and go to heaven. It's so that He, as He did in the Old Testament, used Israel, He now will use Jews and Gentiles directly, personally, to indirectly reach all the other nations. So, that's a great lesson. It's irrefutable because it comes from Koine. That is, I don't know of any other theological expression greater than the Koine, because it is why we call it our New Testament. So enjoy the study, contemplate on it.